So over the last few weeks, I've had the opportunity to grow some mushrooms in the shroom room, which is a mushroom grow chamber concept designed by a group called First Bill. I did an unboxing video earlier that goes over some of the features, so if you want to go watch that first, go ahead and check that out. But in this video, I'm going to go over a couple of the grows, talk about what worked really well, and then suggest a couple things that might be a great addition for a version 2. So before I get into the specifics, I just want to say that this thing is awesome for at-home mushroom growers that just want a simple solution to providing the perfect conditions for mushrooms to grow. It's really hard to beat something like this. Because not only does it look cool and it displays your mushrooms beautifully while growing, but it actually works. The two things that mushrooms need to grow properly are humidity and fresh air, and this unit makes it easy to provide both of those. Maintaining humidity especially is really easy. This thing is totally automated in the way that it does it, and it uses a wicking humidifier instead of an ultrasonic humidifier. So basically there's just a basin with a filter in it and then a fan that blows air through this filter that absorbs water and then humidifies the inside of the unit. And that's hugely advantageous over an ultrasonic humidifier, which humidifies by kind of creating a condensing fog inside of a growing chamber. But if you have a condensing fog inside of this unit, then number one, you wouldn't really be able to see your mushrooms. Number two, it would cause a lot of excess moisture. But with this wicking humidifier, it keeps it right at that level of humidity that you want, somewhere between 90 and 100% relative humidity, without causing a lot of condensation. Now, before I grew mushrooms in here, I kind of worried if that was going to be enough or if there's going to be, running into some issues with not enough humidity, but that wasn't the case at all. The humidity inside of this unit is perfectly fine for not only causing mushrooms to pin, which is what I was really worried about, but also for growing mushrooms to full size without having to worry about the humidity dropping out. Now, it's not totally automated because the water does dry out every few days, depending on how much fresh air is coming in and the amount of humidity in that fresh air that's coming in, but it's pretty easy to fill up. You just kind of open the lid. I had a little bottle that I kept beside the unit as the mushrooms were growing, and I just poured it into the basin and made sure there was always enough water in there to keep the humidity high. Now, maintaining a good amount of fresh air is also really easy to do. There's just a fan that draws in fresh air from the outside and blows it into the unit. Now, there's settings in the software that comes with this unit where you can kind of change the amount of fresh air that comes into it. So it's not based off of a CO2 meter that automatically brings in fresh air, it's just based on a certain period. So you can choose to have the fan run, for example, every 10,000 seconds, you can turn it on for 500 seconds, and that will continuously change the air inside of the unit. Now, you're gonna wanna have different amounts of fresh air depending on what types of mushrooms you're growing, but luckily, this unit, it's super easy to modify that, which I'll talk about a little bit later when I'm talking about growing oyster mushrooms. So let's jump into some of the specific grows that I did so far in this unit. So the first mushrooms I tried to grow inside of here were chestnut mushrooms, also known as Pholiota adiposa. And there's no specific reason why I chose chestnut mushrooms, just happened to be what I had going on at the time. Now, in general, chestnut mushrooms are pretty easy to grow, but this unit made it even easier. And actually, it was a really good test because I took one block of chestnut mushrooms and put it inside of this shroom room, and I put the rest of the blocks of chestnut mushrooms inside of just a normal 4-tier greenhouse that was humidified with an ultrasonic humidifier that was bringing in fresh air from the outside. And the differences between this unit and the 4-tier greenhouse were pretty stunning. In this unit, the mushrooms not only pinned faster, but they grew way faster and they just looked better without having to worry about, managing all of that humidity. Everything was just kind of done inside the unit. And they actually ended up growing so much faster. I think I harvested the chestnut mushrooms from this unit a full week before I was able to harvest the mushrooms from the 4-tier greenhouse. And again, I think that's just because this unit maintained perfect levels of humidity, always bringing in fresh air. And also there was nice lighting because there's 4 LED lights underneath, which I think really helped both the pinning and growing the mushrooms to fruition. But the 4-tier chamber was a lot slower. Like I said, they took about 3 or 4 days longer to pin, and the mushrooms just weren't quite as nice as they were inside of this chamber. Now, chestnut mushrooms don't require a ton of fresh air, but still I could tell that they were a little bit choked inside of this fruiting chamber. And the way you can tell that is they'll have longer stems and smaller caps because the mushrooms are looking to find that fresh air in order to eventually spread their spores. But still, I was able to grow some pretty darn looking nice chestnut mushrooms inside of this chamber. Now, I did have to move the block around quite a bit in this chamber to try and optimize for the space. because it does fit the block in there quite nicely, but as the mushrooms grow, you might have to worry about it kind of like bumping up against the walls or bumping up against the door. But you know, even with that, I was able to actually get 2 blocks of chestnut mushrooms and have them kind of grow towards each other in the middle. So there's just a nice canopy of chestnut mushrooms inside the unit, and it still handled it really well. This did make me rethink a little bit though, how to kind of optimize space inside of this chamber. And you might have to change the way you're making your fruiting blocks or change the way that you're fruiting your mushrooms out of those blocks in order to optimize for the amount of space in the chamber. Now, the next mushrooms I tried to grow in here were oyster mushrooms, specifically pearl oyster mushrooms. And I did this on purpose because oyster mushrooms are notoriously hard to grow indoors. They have monster requirements for fresh air, and if they have too much CO2, they grow totally weird with, you know, those really tiny caps and long weird stems, and they just don't quite look right. So since they're kind of notoriously hard to grow inside, I thought it would be a good test to try and grow them inside of this chamber. So the first attempt to grow oyster mushrooms in this thing, to be honest, was not that great. I put the block in there and then I just kind of left it with the stock settings. And when I came back to check on it, the pins were growing, which meant the humidity was great, but they were kind of elongated and they were starting to look like they weren't getting enough fresh air. So I did increase the amount of fresh air a little bit, but kind of forgot about it a couple days. And when I came back, the mushrooms grew, but they had that typical long stem and tiny cap, that typical I need more fresh air thing that the oyster mushrooms do. And they still grew okay. I mean, I grew some mushrooms and they were fine. We were able to use them, but not ideal for what you want oyster mushrooms to look like. So what I did was, after I harvested that first flush, I put the block back in the chamber and massively increased the amount of fresh air. Basically, the fan was running for just as much time as the fan was off. So it was kind of, you know, half of the time was bringing in fresh air, and that did make a difference. And that's actually the mushrooms that are in here right now. These are some, you know, the second flush of oyster mushrooms. And as you can see, you know, we have some nice big, you know, traditional oyster mushroom caps. And I'll just harvest one here and you can kind of see that's a nice big cap. Now, I guess these aren't the most amazing looking oyster mushrooms, but that right there is telling you that they have enough fresh air and they're not starved for, you know, fresh air, and you can actually grow some nice mushrooms. So if I were to do this again, you know, if I were to do it with the first flush and make sure it has enough fresh air the whole growing cycle, I probably would get some really nice looking clusters of mushrooms with a bunch of mushrooms that have this size of cap. So overall, I would say, you know, it does work. You just got to be cognizant of how much fresh air is coming into the unit. Now, with that much fresh air coming in all the time, it was running out of water in the basin really quickly. So basically every day I had to fill that up because it was constantly, you know, pulling all of that water out with all that fresh air coming in. But other than that, it was super easy to do. And I would give this the thumbs up. It definitely works for growing oyster mushrooms. So of course this works pretty well, but it is a prototype, which means there is definitely room for improvement. And if I had a magic wand and I could just make any changes I wanted to, here are some of the things that I would try to change for version 2. So first of all, it does moderate humidity and fresh air and lighting, which is really nice. But the one thing that it doesn't do is temperature control. And if I could just, again, wave a magic wand, I would try to make it so you could easily boost it up a few degrees or easily kind of cool it down a few degrees Celsius. Now, as my short experience as an engineer, I realize this might be not the easiest thing to do. I mean, it might be easy enough to kind of heat it, but cooling is kind of on a different level. So it's not a huge deal. I mean, you might want to just consider working with the seasonality of where you live and the temperatures inside your house. So maybe grow pink oyster mushrooms and reishi in the summer and save your enoki and blue oyster and lion's mane for the winter when it might be a little bit cooler. But again, if you could change the temperatures, it would be totally next level, although it's not a totally necessary feature. Also, what would be super cool to have would be a carbon dioxide sensor, so that instead of just, you know, changing the fresh air based on the cycles or time periods of the fan, if it automatically brought in fresh air when it noticed that, you know, the level of CO2 was getting too high inside of the chamber. And that would just kind of automate the process. So again, you could get mushrooms that look like this and not mushrooms that look super weird because, you know, you allowed the carbon dioxide to get too high. Again, this would be a really nice feature, but it's not a huge deal because it's not too hard to just kind of manage the fresh air by going into the software and changing the settings. And I know that like CO2 sensors are really expensive, so maybe it wouldn't be worth it because it would just increase the price of the unit without all that much added benefit. Because for the most part, it's not too hard to manage just with the software alone. But again, magic wand, I would put a CO2 sensor inside of the unit. unit. One other problem I did run into was for both grows, both the chestnuts and the oyster mushrooms, I left them too long and they dropped the spores everywhere, because that's what mushrooms do at the end of the life cycle, they drop spores. But the spore load is actually pretty insane, and especially for the chestnut mushrooms, they dropped all over the fan because it's not covered. And then, you know, if you left that long enough, the spores would kind of clog up the fan. So again, it wasn't a big deal, but I had to take everything out, clean that fan out with a little Q-tip, and make sure that nothing kind of got clogged in there. So same thing happened with the oyster mushrooms. Again, the better way to deal with this is just harvest your mushrooms before they drop too many spores. But if you forget about it for a couple days, like I did, or like a lot of people that are gonna grow mushrooms inside of one of these do, it would be nice if you had some sort of cover on the fan, or you know, something where it brought in air, or use that wicking filter in a different way so that the fan wasn't exposed. Because again, I think if you got too many spores in there, it would kind of clog it up and you might end up eventually breaking the fan. So that would be one thing to do, but maybe I should just harvest my mushrooms earlier. And finally, there's a filter that sits in the basin, and again, when the mushrooms sporulate, that filter can get all clogged and covered in spores, and you might want to clean it. So you got to take the filter out, kind of rinse it out and let it dry. And it would be nice to kind of have a backup filter that you could just slip in there, so you wouldn't have to have your unit down for a couple days while you're changing out your filter. But really, other than that, this unit works really well. I think if anybody wanted to grow mushrooms at home, you would benefit greatly from having something like this. It saves you from having to grow with a shotgun fruiting chamber, which works, but is kind of a pain. And it also saves you from having to just be at the whim of whatever environmental conditions you might have inside of your house. But I would love to hear what you think. I did just talk to First Build, and they are looking at different ways of potentially producing a commercial version of this unit. So I want to know from you, number one, do you think you would use something like this? Do you think you'd benefit from something like this? Would you actually pay for or buy something like this? And if you did, what kind of features would you like to see? Is there some sort of improvement that you'd like to see? Maybe a different layout or different components in there, or something that would make your mushroom experience a lot better? I would love to hear what you think. And until next time, thanks so much for watching the video, and we'll see you in the next one.